dears, have you heard of Grudnia Efimovna Sukareva, the woman who was the first to publish research on autism? No? Have you heard of Hans Asperger? Okay, we're going to start with some of the basics of autism history, and then we'll see where Grudnia fits in. And because I am too lazy to rewrite my script, we're going to hear from former Sydney about it with a bad camera. But anyway, content warning here for Nazism, eugenics, and euthanasia. Feel free to skip to this time code if you need.
So in 1908, Swiss scientist Paul-Eugen Bleuler coined the term autismus. It uses two Greek roots, autos meaning self and ismus meaning state of being. He called it this to reflect the somewhat withdrawn affect of his autistic patients. Before this term was created, and for a while after, autism was known as childhood schizophrenia. It wasn't researched in depth until the 1940s. So the first researcher was Hans Asperger, a pediatrician in Nazi Vienna who began giving talks in the late 1930s about his autistic psychopathy. He cited positive aspects of autism and called some of his patients absent-minded professors, though unfortunately in the majority of cases the positive aspects of autism do not outweigh the negative ones. Oi. His research was part of the Nazi effort to categorize people and eliminate the genetically unfit. He studied over 200 children, often for several months, and those he deemed unsalvageable were sent to Am Spiegelgrund, a child euthanasia clinic. Traits he called precocious in boys were seen as annoying in cries for attention in girls. He diagnosed many of the girls in his clinic with hysteria and/or hormone issues instead of his autistic psychopathy. All of his patients were white, and his final paper describing this condition only discussed 4 boys. At the same time, in the US, there was a scientist named Leo Kanner who did his research at Johns Hopkins and coined the term infantile autism. He studied 3 girls and 8 boys, all but 2 of which were of Anglo-Saxon descent. He created the idea of refrigerator mothers, the idea that though some autistic traits are innate from birth, most of it is the result of parents not loving their children enough. This then led a psychologist by the name of Bruno Bettelheim to separate autistic kids from their parents in following years. People thought for a while that this was an odd case of 2 scientists discovering the same thing in 2 separate places at the same time, though it turns out that Kenna knew of Asperger's work and simply didn't cite it, so it was lost from autism research until the 1980s. If you want to read a deeply upsetting but also incredible book about autism history, I highly recommend Nerve Tribes by Steve Silberman, as well as Asperger's Children by Edith Schaeffer.
Wow, isn't autism history just delightful? So anyway, you may be thinking, based on this summary, that Asperger was the first person to write about autism and then was copied by Kanner without being given credit. But it turns out that in 1925, a decade before Asperger, a Soviet psychiatrist by the name Grudnia Efimovna Sukareva published a paper describing autistic characteristics. Better than Asperger. Now, before we get into her research and whatnot, let's talk about who this lovely lady was. Grudnia grew up in a Jewish family in Kiev, the capital of what is now known as Ukraine, and she graduated from medical school in Kiev in 1915. She then went to work at psychiatric hospitals both in Kiev and Moscow, as well as teaching and mentoring doctoral students. In her lifetime, she published several textbooks, 6 monographs, and more than 150 papers. So while she's relatively unknown to the Western world, many cite her as the most well-known name in child psychiatry in Russia. On top of her research into autistic children, which we will get into in a hot second, she also fought for difficult children to be sent to medical institutions rather than labor camps, and she opened schools for autistic children that saw their humanity, catered to their therapies and needs, more on the side of occupational therapies, and gave them a proper education. And many students were actually able to go on from there to regular schools and music conservatories once they'd graduated from the program. Grudnia and her colleagues took painstaking notes about each patient, when they smiled a little less, or what made them flop their hands, or what kinds of things triggered a meltdown for them. And they kept detailed notes of these. And because of that, she was able to notice clear patterns of behavior, both for each individual and across patients as well, which made her description of autism weirdly close to the description that we have in the DSM-5 today. She documented sensory atypicalities, something not widely recognized by psychologists until the DSM-5 in 2013, and was also the first to notice and document that autistic traits run in families. Now, I won't bore you with her descriptions of autism because they are essentially the description that we use today, which you can find in my What is Autism video in the card above, but I would like to emphasize that they're not just, the absent-minded professor. Grudnia observed many of the nuances and the lesser-known traits of autism that have only been very recently recognized and widely accepted by the scientific community. So the next question you're probably thinking is, well, why the heck don't we all know about her, and why did it take us so long to figure out all these things that she already published in the 1920s? And there are several unfortunate reasons behind them, most of them Nazi related. So Gruny's paper on autism was published in Russian in 1925 and then a year later in German. So, in all likelihood, Hans Asperger not only read it but used it to influence his work, but then didn't cite her. Probably because she was a Jewish woman from the Soviet Union and he was in the Nazi Party, which discriminated against, well, all of those things. So it wouldn't have been in his best interest to cite her as one of the sources. Her paper wasn't translated into English until 1996. Now, I can't help but wonder what life would be like for autistic people today if our initial definitions and therapies had been based on her work rather than Asperger and Kanner. Anyway, again, another short video. Am I okay? I hope that you learned a thing today, because I sure did. As always, thank you for listening, thank you for learning. Remember, your story isn't over, it has only just begun, and I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.